In the last couple of years, I've been in the thousands of talks I give all over the place. I've found myself kind of reluctantly giving talks about endangered species, meaning by that things like democracy, human rights, socioeconomic development, others. But the prime one, unfortunately, is human beings, ourselves. I think there's a very serious threat to survival. It's not a joke. It's following from, as a consequence of policies that have a great deal of elite support, a lot of popular opposition, overwhelming popular opposition, but more ominously, they're rational policies. That is, rational within a framework of ideological and socioeconomic institutions that exist and are pretty stable. And within that framework, policies leading almost inexorably to self-destruction do appear rational and are being pursued. I want to talk about some of these. These are not going to be things that are, actually I've been giving quite a few talks here in the last couple of days in this area, and they've mostly been on topical matters, but I want to turn to things that are maybe, in my view, more important. They do involve issues of survival, but are not on the front pages. They ought to be. However, first I will say a couple of words about things that are on the front pages. These concerns have been put to the side in the last several months by, at least in public discussion, by the threat of international terrorism, which compels us to peer into the abyss of the future. That's a title. It's supposed to be careful about plagiarism these days, and that's plagiarism. I took it from a full-page headline in the New York Times about September 11th. Well, September 11th was undoubtedly a major atrocity, major terrorist atrocity, and it was regarded that way throughout the world, virtually without exception. However, sometimes it is useful to pay a little bit of attention to what people are saying outside the little cocoon of rich and privileged and powerful people within which most of us spend all our lives. Me too. And in fact, there were interesting things to say outside of that about international terrorism. It was, so for example, in Central America and the Middle East, which have had considerable experience with international terrorism, described as a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself in a return to barbarism in the modern age, so on. I happen to be quoting Secretary of State George Shultz. He was the moderate of the Reagan administration. Some of you will remember. They came to office 20 years ago declaring that the war against international terrorism was going to be the focus of U.S. foreign policy, and particularly they would concentrate on Central America and the Middle East, which they described as the center of the operations of the depraved opponents of civilization itself. Well, it's interesting that we haven't heard anything about this in the last 6 months after the war on terrorism was redeclared on September 11th. It wasn't declared. It was the same war with the same rhetoric, actually even the same people, if you look. Probably it'll be carried out about the same way, has been so far. But nothing has been said about this not very ancient history, although in places like the Central America and the Middle East, they haven't forgotten it that quickly. The places where the war against terrorism was focused. In Central America and the Middle East, they have memories. Like they have memories of the fact that the defenders of civilization launched terrorist campaigns of unprecedented scale and violence in both areas, in Central America and the Middle East, which has overwhelmed any other terrorism that might be taking place there. by orders of magnitude. And this they do remember, undoubtedly. I just happened to return a couple of weeks ago from the site of one of the more recent international terrorist campaigns, namely southeastern Turkey, where there was a savage assault against the population beginning in the mid-'80s, peaking in the 1990s, far worse than anything that Milosevic is being tried for, connection with Kosovo. 2 or 3 million people made refugees, a couple of thousand towns and villages destroyed, tens of thousands of people killed. Kurds, this Turkish campaign against the Kurds, every imaginable form of torture and barbarism. It's all well reported in human rights reports and scholarly literature and so on, and of course they know all about it. It's international terrorism because we paid for it. It was all done with the military and economic and doctrinal support, diplomatic support of the United States, first by the Reagan-Bush administrations, but then peaking under Clinton. In fact, in the year 1997 alone, Turkey, that single year, Turkey received more U.S. military aid than in the entire period from the beginning of the Cold War up till the onset of the counterinsurgency campaign in the mid-'80s combined. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Cold War. It's just straight, outright international terrorism, organized, paid for, supported, encouraged in Washington, and primarily by Clinton. He ended up providing 80% of the arms, and Turkey, in fact, became the leading recipient of U.S. Arms outside of Israel and Egypt by the end of the 1990s. By 1999, it was replaced by Colombia as the leader, and that's the focus of the next major war against terror, which will be very much like the earlier ones. You can be sure of that, and they don't doubt it. Well, the repression of the Kurds had been far worse than anything bad as Kosovo might have been. It was far worse than anything reported there and remains so right up until the present moment. It's a kind of dungeon for millions of people now. You may have read in the papers today or heard on NPR, as I did driving somewhere, that for the first time Afghans were able to celebrate the Persian New Year. Great celebration about that, and it's a good thing. Not for the reasons they talked about, but we can be happy that they did that. The same celebration takes place in Kurdish areas, in all the sort of Kurdish Persian areas everywhere, except southeastern Turkey, where it was banned by the Turkish government. A couple of people killed, big demonstrations. The United States is now sending Turkey to fight the war on terror in Afghanistan in gratitude for their achievements of the 1990s and conducting some of the worst terrorist atrocities of those years. And in fact, that is regarded as a model. So if you read State Department reports or the front page of the New York Times, articles by their terrorism experts, they laud Turkey for having demonstrated how one should deal with terrorism and serve as a model for the future, and therefore they're the ones who should take responsibility for fighting the war on terror in Afghanistan. This is quite a tribute to the servility, I guess is the right word, of the educated classes in the West. All of this passes without notice. Virtually none of it was reported, still isn't reported. Beyond just suppressing the fact, they are even lauded for the achievement of conducting some of the worst international terrorism of the last few years, and serving now as a model to how to conduct the war against terror. Well, nothing here surprises anyone in Central America or the Middle East, or in fact most of the world, because they're quite familiar with how wars against terror are carried out. All of this simply illustrates what ought to be a complete truism. Terrorism has a definition. It means, it refers to the terrorism that others carry out against us. If we carry out against them at 1,000 times the level, that's not terrorism. And furthermore, that's in the United States, that's universal. You can try hard to find an exception to it in the scholarly literature or journalism or everything else, but it's not just the United States. As far as I know, it's universal. I think it's a historical universal. I can't find an incident in modern or past history when that hasn't been true. So if you take the worst mass murderers who existed, say the Nazis in occupied Europe, take a look at their propaganda, they were defending the population against the terrorism of the resistance, which was directed and supported from abroad, and defending the legitimate governments like Vichy against these terrorists. And like all propaganda, there's a certain element of truth to it. Nobody doubted that the partisans were being directed and supported from London and Washington. That was perfectly open. And they undoubtedly carried out terrorist acts. If you can think of a resistance movement in history that didn't, I'd like to hear about it. It's not to say that it's a good thing, but it's just a fact. So there was some truth to the Nazi propaganda that they were fighting a war against terror, and we can take pride in the fact that we're in good company. It's not all that different. As I say, I don't know of any exceptions. I presume if we had records from Attila the Hun, we'd probably find the same thing. If anybody can think of an exception, I'd like to hear it. I'd add it as a footnote somewhere. Some of these things remain in memory, some don't, and they follow the principle. So, for example, on March 11th, there were solemn ceremonies around the country, very well reported, commemorating the six-month anniversary of the atrocities of the World Trade Center. That was a serious terrorist attack. Undoubtedly, it's the first terrorist attack first military attack, first violent attack against the national territory of the United States since 1814, when the British burned down Washington. And every December 7th, and that's justified, you should commemorate that. On every December 7th, we commemorate an attack against military bases in 2 U.S. colonies on 1941. And yes, those are terrorist atrocities or aggression as well, and that makes sense. We should commemorate those crimes. There are others that pass without mention. For example, this month, which had March of 2002, happens to be the 40th anniversary of March 1962. That was the month in which the Kennedy administration publicly announced that it was sending the U.S. Air Force to bomb South Vietnam and initiate chemical warfare to destroy food crops, authorized napalm, officially began the project of driving hundreds of thousands of people. It ended up being maybe 10 million people into concentration camps and slums, try to overcome indigenous resistance. That's 40 years this month. Haven't noticed any commemorations or any reference to it. And the reason is it's kind of like the atrocities in southeast Turkey. It didn't happen. And it didn't happen because we did it. And since we did it, it's not a crime. In fact, it's not even part of history. Maybe, as far as I know, in fact, that one is even lauded as a noble cause and a noble achievement. Left millions of... South Vietnam was the main target of the U.S. attack all the way through. Ended up practically destroyed, the rest of the Indochina along with it. Millions of corpses. Nobody knows within millions, literally, what the number of dead was. Because of another principle, you don't investigate your own crimes. You investigate other people's crimes with, laser-like intensity. But your own, since they don't exist, there's no need to investigate them, and we don't even know. In fact, among the general public, information is so slight that the one study I know of that was done to try to see what people thought, So what's your guess as to how many Vietnamese victims there were? It turns out the mean guess is 100,000. That's as if in Germany, now, if you ask people how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust, the mean guess was maybe 200,000. If that happened in Germany, we'd think there's a problem there. If you got results like that. Well, we don't think there's a problem here because Germany was defeated, and therefore they have to face the facts of what they did. But the United States has always been victorious 100% of the time. And when you're always victorious, it's very bad for the character. And part of the defect is you just don't pay attention to what you did to other people. So therefore, you don't have to worry about how the first war on terror was waged, or how this one's being waged, or the fact that some of the major terrorist atrocities of just the last few years are, in fact, not only the atrocities overlooked, they're actually lauded as successes in counterterror, and the agent of them is praised. Sometimes it takes real effort to ignore these things. So you may have seen a couple of days ago, I got the clipping here, March 11th, there was a front page story in the New York Times, probably the San Francisco Chronicle, about big headlines as "Some see panic as main effect of dirty bombs." Some Federation of American Scientists discovered that radioactive materials that are in quite wide use in the United States, radioactive cobalt rods that are used to irradiate food and so on, can be turned, in principle at least, into what they call dirty bombs. They could be spread over cities, say New York. They say these would be weapons of terror that would probably kill few people, but would spread panic and produce severe economic damage, would raise radiation levels above what's acceptable by the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and would undoubtedly cause panic. So that's a front page story, and it should be, indicates the kind of abyss that we should be peering into. The couple of days before that, 3 days before that, the wire services reported, it was barely, had a friend do a database search, barely noted in the press, but all the wire services reported a conference going on in Vietnam, which had leading U.S. specialists on public health, mainly concerned with the effects of chemical warfare. This is not the possibility that a few people might suffer from a dirty bomb in the future, but rather the chemical warfare of the years of the 1960s, beginning in March 1962. The leading U.S. specialist, a professor at the University of Texas, had been doing blood tests of dioxin levels around South Vietnam. North Vietnam was spared this particular atrocity. It was just the South that had the chemical warfare attacks beginning just 40 years ago. And he found dioxin levels up to 200 times above average. That's one of the most severe carcinogens. There is some investigation of this by foreign journalists. One of the leading Israeli reporters, very well-known and respected reporter, Amnon Kapeliuk, traveled through the region in 1988 and reported in Israel that what he called hideous deformities among children, deformed fetuses in the hospitals, horrible effects. He estimated at that time, 1988, about 250,000 victims. The public health specialist a couple of days ago pointed out that there's still new victims, so it's something very lasting. But again, that's not a crime. It's not like the possibility that some people might be affected by dirty bombs by terrorists in the future. 1 million people affected by U.S. chemical warfare in South Vietnam, so therefore it isn't even worth mentioning. Actually, sometimes it is mentioned. About 10 years ago, there was an article in the New York Times in the science section by their Southeast Asia correspondent, Barbara Cressett, who pointed out that it's kind of a mistake for us not to investigate this question, because it's a perfect experimental situation. We have two genetically identical populations, North and South Vietnam, so we have a control group and a test group. One of them was subjected to intensive U.S. chemical warfare, the other was not, and if we investigated it, we might learn something that would be useful for us. So therefore, we're kind of overlooking a real opportunity by not paying any attention to this problem. The conception that maybe we ought to do something about it, like pay reparations or try to cure people or something, I mean, that is so remote from, it's just unintelligible. The words don't mean anything. You can't say it in polite company. Well, those two stories differed in that one was a front page story and the other was unmentioned, and that again illustrates the principles. The principles are, we don't commit any crimes. It's kind of a logical impossibility, and terrorism is what they do to us, not what we do to them. So therefore, it was unnecessary in the past 6 months to report anything about the history of terrorism. And if you look carefully, you'll find nothing. Nothing about the first war on terrorism, nothing about the fact that the same people who ran that one are running this one, and nothing about the fact that the U.S. was condemned for international terrorism in Central America by the World Court, would have been by the Security Council if it hadn't vetoed a resolution calling on all states to observe international law. The current leader of the war on terrorism is the only state in the world that has the happens to be both condemned by the highest international tribunal for international terrorism, but also happens to be the only state in the world that has vetoed a Security Council resolution calling on states to observe international law. Its assistants in its coalition partners are leading terrorist states. Russia is delighted to join the war on terrorism, to have authorization for its atrocities in Chechnya, same in China, same in Israel. Turkey stepped up repression. That's what I was there for, and is now honored by taking over the role of leading the war on terrorism in Afghanistan. All of this passes unnoticed, unmentioned. If you can find a word about it in the reams of paper that have poured out, I'd be surprised. I haven't. Well, that's inside the cocoon. We happen to be rich, privileged, victorious, powerful. We don't have any responsibility to pay any attention to what's going on in the world. Well, outside the cocoon, you hear different voices. So in Diyarbakir, where I was a couple of weeks ago in southeast Turkey, where the celebrations were just banned yesterday with troops and demonstrations and killings, they do condemn the September 11th atrocities. But they also remember very well their own suffering at our hands, which vastly exceeds anything that took place in September 11th, horrible as that was, and they still live under harsh military rule that relies crucially on U.S. support at every possible level. That means military support and also silence, which is major support for atrocities. In Central America, up and down the region, again, if you read the press, the atrocities of September 11th were condemned, but with memories. So in Panama, for example, one of the least affected countries, the press condemned the September 11th bombings the way everybody else did, atrocities the way everyone else did, but pointed out we're not unfamiliar with it. And they referred to Operation Just Cause, George Bush I, who invaded Panama and in one bombing raid, attacking a poor barrio, a slum, Barrio Chorrillo, according to the Panamanians, killed a couple of thousand people in one raid. Well, we don't know anything about that since, again, it's our crime, so you don't look at it. But the Panamanian estimates are approximately 3,000 people killed in one bombing raid in Operation Just Cause, which was, as you'll recall, an operation undertaken to kidnap kind of a minor thug whose crime was disobedience, not criminality. He had carried out plenty of criminal acts. He was kidnapped, brought to the United States after the U.S. vetoed two Security Council resolutions, and carried out a few actions like the one I just described. He was tried, sentenced. He's now in jail for crimes that he committed while he was on the CIA payroll, almost entirely. But the Panamanians remember that. We don't. And they remember it when they condemn the crimes of September 11th. In Nicaragua, the journal of the research journal of the Jesuit University, which is the main research journal in Central America, they condemned the bombings and the atrocities of the World Trade Center and Pentagon of September 11th as they said it could be called Armageddon, but we too have remember our own excruciating Armageddon, which left tens of thousands of people dead, devastated the country, may never recover. It's sort of gone down far below ever since the U.S. took it over again in 1990. It's now the second poorest country in the hemisphere after Haiti, which also remembers a number of things. For example, they remember that they've been the target of most U.S. intervention, military intervention in the 20th century, and are now the poorest country in the hemisphere. They also remember that right in the midst of all the furor about the unwillingness of the Taliban to hand over alleged criminals, suspected criminals, and meaning that we have a right to bomb them because they don't want to hand these people over to us, that we refuse to provide any evidence and refuse to consider their offers of negotiation. Right while all this was going on, Haiti renewed its request for the extradition, a formal extradition, of a leading war criminal, Emmanuel Constant, who's happily living in New York. He was the head of the paramilitary forces that were responsible for killing maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people in the 1990s under a military junta, which was in fact supported by Bush #1 and Clinton, and they've sentenced him in absentia. There's no problem in this case about finding evidence or finding the perpetrator, but the U.S. won't extradite him, nor will the press even report it because it's so insignificant. 4,000 or 5,000 black people. The reason why the U.S. refuses to extradite him, everyone presumes, is that if he is brought to Haiti and tried in person, he'll spill the beans on his CIA connections during the period in which he was running the atrocities. And it's better to keep that quiet, even though it's not really all that controversial. Well, it's really easy to continue, and I'll stop. But we could go on for hours like this. These differences are, it really takes discipline not to see them. They are so overwhelmingly transparent. And the fact that they are literally unmentioned is, again, a major tribute to our educational institutions. It takes, you have to give them credit for being able to create people like us, me too, go through these things and come out well trained, so as not to see things that are so glaringly obvious and so humanly significant. It's not like missing some triviality. We're talking about things of extraordinary importance. Well, that's international terrorism, if we want to peer down that abyss, and that's what we'll see if we look there with our eyes open. But let me just continue a little, turn over to the Middle East again. That was Central America. After September 11th, some of the press, particularly the Wall Street Journal, did do what they should have done. They began investigating opinion in the region to find out why people, they were trying to find out the answer to George Bush's plaintive question, why do they hate us when we're so good? How can that be? So within actually, even before he asked the question, the Wall Street Journal had provided some of the answers. They did do what they should have done. They did an investigation of opinions in the region. Now, they kept to the people they care about. So they had it was what they called moneyed Muslims, meaning bankers, lawyers, managers of branches of U.S. corp transnationals, that kind of people. People are right inside the U.S. system. And of course, naturally despise Osama bin Laden because they're his main targets. They're the ones he's after, so they don't like him. And in that group, you can't. What's their opinion about the United States? Well, it turns out they're very antagonistic to U.S. policy, though they're in the main policies they're just part of, like the international economic policies. But what they opposed democracy, independent development, supporting corrupt, brutal regimes, they're naturally strongly opposed to the unilateral U.S. support for the Israeli military occupation, which is very harsh and brutal. It's now in its 35th year. Strongly opposed the U.S. sanctions against Iraq, which they understand perfectly well, and you know it too, so I won't go into it, are devastating the population but strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they remember another thing that we like to forget, that the United States and Britain supported him right through his worst atrocities, continued to help him develop weapons of mass destruction, didn't see anything wrong with gassing Kurds or anything else. They remember that, even if we choose to sweep it under the carpet. And for reasons like that, they say a lot of hatred of U.S. policies, despite the fact that they're right in the middle of the entire U.S. system. Well, that's one answer to George Bush's question. It's not the kind of answer you read in most of the intellectual journals and the press and so on. There you read sophisticated answers about how people of that region have bad cultures, or they are left out by globalization, or they, can't stand our freedoms and our magnificence, and so on and so forth. Anyone who is seriously concerned with these issues, certainly anyone who's a specialist in international affairs or the Middle East, knows that there's nothing new about these answers. You can go way back and find them as far back as you want to go. One of the good places to look, one of the advantages of living here, is that the United States has become, over the years, a very free country. Not a gift from the gods, but as a result of plenty of popular struggle, it's become an unusually free country. Uniquely so in some respects. We have more information about high-level U.S. policy planning than you can find about any country in the world that I know about. Tons of declassified material which shows how policy is being conducted and what the thinking is. Obvious place to look, if you want to find out more about this, is the records for 1958. The reason is that 1958 was a critical year in U.S. international affairs for a lot of reasons. I'll explain it later if you like, but in particular with regard to the Middle East. It was a critical year because it was the first year in which some country, namely Iraq, had been able to break out of the Anglo-American condominium over the world's energy resources. Iran had tried, conservative nationalist regime, but there was a military coup, U.S.-British military coup that overthrew it. Iraq actually broke out, and it was a huge issue, big flurry of activity, military forces all over the place, almost came to nuclear weapons. It was an enormous issue. So if you want to understand what the U.S. was thinking about, you look back to those records. Well, if you do, you find that President Eisenhower, in internal discussion, observed to his staff, his words, that there's a campaign of hatred against us in the Middle East, not by governments, but by the people. And there was discussion about this. The National Security Council, the highest planning body, gave their analysis. They said that the reason is that there's a perception in the region that the United States is supporting harsh and brutal and corrupt regimes, and is blocking democratization and development, and is doing so because of our interest in controlling the oil reserves of the region. And they said it's difficult to counter this perception because it's accurate. And not only is it accurate, but it should be accurate. It said it is natural for us to support status quo governments, meaning the kind I just described, and to prevent democracy and development because we want to maintain control over the energy resources of the region. So there's a campaign of hatred against us by the people, and that's the reason for it. Essentially the same as what the Wall Street Journal discovered on September 14th, and anybody knew in between. The only difference is that, of course, some of the specific policies, like the sanctions against Iraq, are new and so on, but the general policies are the same. And they're talking about the people, not just moneyed Muslims. And among the people, there's a much deeper resentment because they don't see any particular reason why the wealth of the region should flow to the West and to the moneyed Muslims, but who are cooperating with the West and not to them. Kind of backward cultures, as you read, and this idea somehow hasn't penetrated their minds and still hasn't. So there's an even deeper campaign of hatred among the people who aren't moneyed Muslims in the middle of the U.S. system. So if you want to listen to some voices outside the cocoon, it's not hard to hear them, and they'll answer the questions about why there's a campaign of hatred against us, whether it's now or in 1958, and in a good part of the rest of the world, where people just don't enjoy being ground to dust under somebody's boot. They don't like it, and it leads to hatred. You can avoid, you can indulge in the fantasies if you like, but that's a choice. You certainly don't have to. There's a lot more to say about this, but let me put these relatively topical issues aside and look at some other things. A couple of weeks ago, you read, certainly, the front page stories on George Bush's, current Bush's, nuclear posture review. And that was kind of interesting. It wasn't interesting because of the content. There was almost nothing new in the content. What was interesting is that it was reported, that it had been leaked and reported. And since the content is essentially the same as everything that preceded, which was already public, though not reported, one wants to know why was it suddenly leaked and reported. And here we can only speculate, but my guess is that there probably are people inside the administration who aren't happy about the fact that certified lunatics have their hand very close to the button. Some of them you may actually have run into on the Stanford campus. But there have been a number of leaks recently which kind of suggest that there's a concern that things may really get out of hand, even from the point of view of elite interests. Anyway, that's a guess. What is not a guess is that the content of the nuclear posture review, insofar as it was revealed, is pretty much the same as the preceding 10 years. Right after the end of the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall fell and no more Russians, there were quickly discussions of tactical changes to deal with the new situation. Some of it was public, and what's public is really sufficient to natural again, but sufficient to gain an understanding of what's happening and where we're heading, and some other abysses into which we might peer, much deeper ones than international terrorism in this case. The first conclusion, which was correct by the Joint Chiefs, was that the U.S. is no longer facing what is called technically a weapons-rich environment. Russia is a weapons-rich environment, particular place, ton of weapons. We're not facing that any longer. We're now facing a target-rich environment. That is the rest of the world, which is a lot of targets, but not many weapons. So we have to switch planning from a weapons-rich environment to a target-rich environment. In fact, the target-rich environment had always been the focus of military action, but under the pretext that we were protecting ourselves from the weapons-rich environment. Now that's gone, the pretext is gone, and also the deterrent is gone. That was understood right away. That opens up lots of new opportunities. It does require new pretexts and new tactics. The pretexts now couldn't be any longer that basically the plans remain more or less the same, except that you can now shift to mini nukes, little nuclear weapons that you can use against places that aren't weapons rich, what's called adaptive planning, new techniques for dealing with small countries that you want to destroy, and the description changed, the pretext changed. So by March 1990, just a couple of months after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the public documents of the first Bush administration explained publicly, it wasn't reported, but it was public, that in their presentations to Congress about the Pentagon, why we have to have the same old Pentagon system even though there's no more Russians, they explained that the reason now is not that the Russians are coming, but it's the technological sophistication of third world countries. That's the phrase, and that's why we need all this stuff. And we also have to target any country that's capable of producing weapons of mass destruction. Well, if you go over to the chemistry department in Stanford, they'll explain to you that any country that has a high school with a chemistry lab is capable of producing weapons of mass destruction. And those are the countries we have to go after, and that is target rich. And in fact, as for intervention forces, our major intervention forces had always been focused at the Middle East. Huge system, goes from Guam to the Azores, all Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, all aimed at the Middle East. It's been true for years. It has to stay that way. The only thing that's different is the reason, as the Bush presentation said, they have to focus those intervention forces at the Middle East, now I'm quoting, where the threat to our interests that required military intervention could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. So, sorry, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now we got to tell you the truth. It couldn't be laid at the Kremlin's door. That's not the threat to our interests. The threat was indigenous. It's indigenous nationalism, independence, efforts at independence, what's called radical nationalism in the technical literature. That's why we need the intervention forces. Notice that the threat couldn't be laid at Saddam Hussein's door either, because this was March 1990, and he was still a great friend and ally of George Bush. In fact, just then, Bush number one, had sent a high-level senatorial delegation headed by Bob Dole to visit Saddam and bring the president's good wishes and assure him that if he heard some negative criticism from U.S. reporters, it's just that some of these guys are out of line and this free press business makes it hard to shut them up, but he doesn't have to pay any attention to them. Anyway, he wasn't hearing very much, but the little he might have heard, he can sort of forget about. That's when the threat to our interests was not laid at the Kremlin's door, or obviously Iraq's. Well, then comes technical preparation for what they call small-scale conflicts. Small is a relative notion. I mean, they may be small for us, but they're not small for the victims. Like there's nothing small about the terrorist war against Nicaragua from their point of view, or El Salvador, or Guatemala, or Haiti, and on down a long list. Small from our point of view. Well, let me give you some of the flavor of the Clinton-era documents, which are worth listening to, and you might compare them with the current nuclear posture review. It says, this is Clinton, the United States should have this is strategic command, the highest level part of the Pentagon that deals with strategic weapons, Stratcom. This is from a crucial document of theirs, which was gotten on the Freedom of Information Act a couple of years ago, called Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence. So major thinking about how to carry out what's called deterrence. Deterrence, of course, means attack in the post-war period. And it says the U.S. should have available the full range of responses but nuclear weapons are the most important of these because unlike chemical or biological weapons, the extreme destruction from a nuclear explosion is immediate with few, if any, palliatives to reduce its effect. And then it says, though we are not likely, thank goodness for that, we're not likely to use nuclear weapons in less than matters of the greatest national importance or in less than extreme circumstances. They have to be available all the time because they cast their shadow over any crisis or conflict, and we therefore have to have them. Then there's a section called Maintaining Ambiguity, and it says it's important that planners should not be too rational about determining what the opponent values the most. All has to be targeted. It hurts to portray ourselves as too fully rational and cool-headed, that the United States may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked should be part of the national persona we project. It's beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements may appear to be potentially out of control. And it goes on to say, if this sounds familiar, it's not an accident. Nuclear weapons seem destined to be the centerpiece of U.S. strategic deterrence for the foreseeable future. We must therefore reject any no first use policy. There never has been one, but we must not institute one. We make it clear that our reaction may either be response or preemptive. Actually, that notion of preemptive reaction is an interesting one, which tells you what deterrence means. So we have to have preemptive reaction, which means undermining the stated goal of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We should not agree to any so-called negative security assurances that ban the use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states that are parties to the treaty. All of this has apparently been confirmed by Clinton's internal nuclear posture review, parts of which have been declassified, and subsequent presidential directives. So that's the old nuclear posture stand, and the new one is not very different. Interesting question is why it was suddenly publicized. Heard my guess. For the future, we also have to face for ourselves, now back to terrorism, the fact that small nukes can be smuggled into any country, including the United States, with no difficulty. There's a recent high-level technical report, I'm quoting it, which says well-planned operations to smuggle weapons of mass destruction into the United States would have at least a 90% probability of success, much higher than ICBM delivery. So that raises the question, what's missile defense about if those threats are so enormous? And the answer is the missile defense program does have an effect on existing threats, namely it enhances them. And furthermore, that's understood. It's not a secret. So much of the fuss about ballistic missile defense these days is criticism about whether it'll work. So critics say it's not going to work, too easy to fool it. But I think they're missing the point. It's much more dangerous if it looks like it might work. It's enough for it to look as though it might work, because in this kind of deadly game, appearance and reality are the same thing. Nobody can take a chance. So it looks like it might work. Adversaries, potential adversaries, are going to have to interpret the system as if it would work. They have to, just as we would if it was inverted. And U.S. intelligence has been very clear about the consequences. They point out, have for years, as Clinton years, that if the U.S. deploys a system that looks realistic, that's going, I'm quoting now, that'll impel China to develop new nuclear-armed missiles, expanding its arsenal tenfold, probably with MIRVs, multiple warheads, prompting India and Pakistan to respond with their own buildups. That then leads to a ripple effect throughout the Middle East. And same intelligence officials predict that Russia and China both would increase proliferation, including selling countermeasures to such nations as North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, and Syria. They also point out that Russia's only rational response to the national missile defense system would be to maintain and strengthen the existing Russian nuclear force. That's the analysis of U.S. intelligence about deploying a system that has even a likelihood of working. The Bush administration agrees. They announced on September 1st that they have no objection to, I'm quoting from the press now, they have no objection to China's plans to build up its small fleet of nuclear missiles. That's shifting policy pretty sharply in the hope of getting Chinese acquiescence to the then planned, now implemented demolition of the ABM treaty. For similar reasons, Clinton's negotiators had already encouraged Russia to adopt what's called a launch on warning strategy, computerized strategy that says, if some computer senses a danger, send off the missiles. The Clinton negotiators had urged Russia to do that. Same reason, try to get them to acquiesce to the programs we're carrying out. Some experts, nuclear experts who were asked about this regarded it as, in their words, pretty bizarre because we know that their computerized systems are deteriorating, their warning systems are deteriorating and full of holes, prone to false alarms. That increases the threat of Russian unauthorized, accidental, or erroneous launches, meaning destruction, we're finished, and that increases the threat. The administration also announced plans to, September 1st again, to share detailed information on its missile defense programs with China. That's going to enhance China's capacity to overcome any U.S. Systems, and also to transfer information to others who have similar concerns about being targeted. Strategic analysts point out that change of policy encourages China to aim more nuclear-armed missiles at the United States and Japan, with the expected effect on Japanese and Taiwanese programs, as well as India, and then onwards. Same day that all this was reported, the national press also reported independently that the U.S. was about to impose sanctions on China for allowing the transfer to Pakistan of missile parts and technology that are essentially for weapons that can carry nuclear warheads. It's all happening at the same time. Clearly, and it's understood, programs like missile defense increase the danger of destruction for the United States and for others. But that's just not important. And furthermore, it's not new. That's the whole history of, that's military history, including the history of the arms race for the last 50 years. So just think about that. 50 years ago, around 1950, there was only one, the U.S. had an overwhelming security, but there was a potential threat on the horizon. Didn't exist yet, but it might come into existence. That was ICBMs with thermonuclear warheads. They weren't around, but sooner or later they would come around. What was the reaction? It was understood. Everybody knew that is a real potential threat to the United States. How is it dealt with? Well, there's a history of the standard history of the arms race by McGeorge Bundy. He was Kennedy Johnson National Security Advisor. He had access to internal records and so on. And he writes in his history that he could find no record of any interest, even any interest, in pursuing the possibility of banning these things, which the Russians probably would have accepted. They were so far behind and so much more threatened by them that there's every possibility they would have agreed to a treaty that banned them. But there was never any interest in this, even though it was the only potential threat to the United States, and a non-trivial threat. Eisenhower once pointed out that a nuclear war would destroy the Northern Hemisphere. That was a threat, but there was no interest in trying to even move towards negotiations that might deter it. The fact of the matter is that if you really look over history, including our own, the threats to survival are considered quite marginal, ranked rather low on the value scale as compared with others like enhancing global dominance. That's a kind of a constant throughout history. The difference today is the scale of the threat, which is significant. There's a lot of, as you know, lots of Russian archives have been coming out. actually people are poring over them to see if they can find some justification for U.S. Cold War policies, and there's not much. But there is some interesting material coming out. Part of what's coming out of the Russian archives is a confirmation of what had already been discussed by U.S. strategic analysts, some of them from inside the intelligence community in the Pentagon, who left and have described it. Now it's confirmed by the Russian archives. The basic story is that, confirmed now by the archival sources on both sides, is that after Stalin's death, after Khrushchev took over mid-50s, his view was that the United States, in his words, was using the arms race to destroy the far weaker Soviet economy, and by that means to obtain its goals even without war. Point is, as he and everybody else knew, the U.S. economy is far larger. If the U.S. runs an extensive arms race and the Russians try to keep up, it'll destroy their economy. And Khrushchev understood that that's U.S. policy. He therefore, over the strong objections of his own military command, we now know this from Russian sources, he initiated a sharp reduction in Soviet offensive military forces and called on the United States to reciprocate. Well, the Eisenhower administration considered it and rejected it, but the death blow to this was given by the Kennedy administration. At that point, Khrushchev made really sharp cuts, called for reciprocity. It was discussed internally and rejected. I'll just quote from the leading scholarly study of the archival records on both sides by Matthew Evangelista. He points out that the Kennedy refusal and their choice instead of a huge escalation of offensive armaments, he said that drove the last nail into the coffin of Khrushchev's agenda of restraining the Soviet military. He was kicked out soon after that, and the arms race picks up and goes on. That's confirmed by internal U.S. sources. Now we have it from both sides. The Soviet reaction to the Kennedy escalation and rejection of these efforts also terminated Khrushchev's reformist programs internally. They might have averted, in fact, it's not impossible that they would have averted this whole social and economic catastrophe. It's first of all, the stagnation of the Soviet economy from the 1960s, which was a result of this, and the immense human catastrophe of the past decade, which is almost historically without precedent, as well as the destruction of Afghanistan, all kind of other atrocities, not to speak of the very serious danger of nuclear destruction, because it's come very close in the past 40 years. But all of that was evidently regarded as a kind of secondary concern by the Kennedy planners and their predecessors, and indeed their successors. Well, without going on with this, there isn't any real novelty in the Clinton and Bush preferences. You look over time, the correlation between security policies and concern for security is very weak. It's historically the case. It's the case now. So what's the ballistic missile defense for? Well, the first thing to bear in mind about it is that everyone takes it to be an offensive weapon, not a defensive weapon. And that's a kind of doctrinal truism. When you hear the word defense, you interpret it as meaning offense. And in this case, it's assumed that that's assumed both by adversaries and by advocates. So, for example, these plans have, of course, been escalated, all of them, not just the missile defense plans, but the much bigger plans for militarization of space, of which they're a small component. They were escalated very sharply after September 11th. The Bush administration saw kind of a window of opportunity to kind of exploit the fear and the concerns of the population and the demands for patriotism, meaning you shut up, to sharply escalate its own agenda on everything, including a major attack against the population, destroying social welfare systems. You know all about this, I don't have to go into it, but also vastly expanding the militarization programs, including the space militarization programs, which they know perfectly well pose a very severe danger far beyond international terrorism to the existence of not only the United States, but in this case, the human species. as I said, even the small component that's missile defense is understood to be an offensive weapon. So China, for example, says what everybody knows when they observe, the top officials, that once the United States believes it has both a strong spear and a strong shield, it could lead them to conclude that nobody can harm the United States and they can harm anybody they like anywhere in the world. Well, the U.S. RAND Corporation, the top military analysis agency, they agree in the same words virtually. They point out that ballistic missile defense, I'm quoting, is not simply a shield, but an enabler of U.S. action. And the logic is obvious. You have a shield, you have a spear. It's pretty obvious. And strategic analysts agree. So kind of at the right end of the spectrum in the journal National Interest, well-known analyst Andrew Basevich writes that by insulating the homeland from reprisal, missile defense will underwrite the capacity and willingness of the United States to shape the environment elsewhere. And he cites approvingly a commentator from the liberal end of the spectrum, the opposite end, Lawrence Kaplan in the New Republic, who says missile defense isn't really meant to protect America, it's a tool for global dominance. It's about preserving America's ability to wield power abroad. It's not about defense, it's about offense, and that's exactly why we need it. He says it'll provide the United States with absolute freedom in using or threatening to use force in international relations. Kaplan, in the New Republic, repeats China's complaint, which he thinks is correct, and he approves of it, namely that it will give the United States the opportunity to do what it wants. It will, in his words, cement U.S. hegemony and make Americans masters of the world, and that's the way things should be. And for exactly that reason, he says, liberal critics are missing the point. They have things exactly backwards. He says missile defense will facilitate the kind of interventions that liberals champion, and therefore they should applaud it. Right? You get the logic. I don't have to explain it. Well, there's kind of a background to this. If you read the same authors and many others, they explain further that there's good reason why we should be in favor of American hegemony. The reason is that history has a natural course, and the United States represents the realization of history's purpose. So I'm quoting, and therefore U.S. domination is kind of by logic beneficial to the rest of the world. If you think there's anything new about this, you haven't studied the right history courses. They're just repeating what was said by leading British intellectuals, people like John Stuart Mill and others, at the peak when Britain enjoyed its day in the sun. And the same is true of, I find the same among lesser aspirants for the prize. That's standard. Whoever you are, the leading intellectuals explain that you represent history's purpose and is therefore beneficial if you rule the world. That's elementary. And therefore, these are the hard-headed realists. I'm not talking about the sentimental types. Now, there is a kind of a problem about missile defense, kind of like a technical paradox, which you can see discussed in the, even in journals like, say, Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal. The problem is that missile defense relies on satellites, and satellites are very easy to shoot down. They're much easier to shoot down than missiles. Missiles, you don't know where they're going, and anything else. Satellites, they're right there. You can track them. Shooting down satellites is kind of like poor man's technology. So how can you have, if we destroy, as we already have, the anti-ABM treaties, well, that means anti-satellite weapons are now legitimate, and that undermines the possibility of missile defense. So it's kind of like a paradox. But there's an answer. The paradox is, it's at least in some imagined world, there's an answer. The answer is what's called full spectrum dominance. That means such overwhelming superiority over everyone else that nobody can even use the poor man's weapon because we will have offensive weapons in space. Here's where the rest of the story comes in. will have offensive weapons in space of extreme destructive power, probably nuclear powered, because there's no other way to get that much energy up there. And they'll be ready for launch with instant computer controlled reaction, because you can't waste any time in these cases. That very much increases the risk of total destruction, mass slaughter and destruction, if only because of what are called in the trade, literally, normal accidents. Normal accidents are the kind of accidents that occur in any complicated system, unpredictably. You know are going to occur, you just don't know when or why. I mean, anybody who has a computer or has tried to install DSL or take BART, you know, like I took BART today, and at one point the doors decided they weren't going to open or something like that. That kind of thing is what's called a normal accident, and it's going to happen in any complicated system. It's almost provable. And this kind of thing guarantees normal accidents along the line. And that once the first one happens, you can say goodbye. That's the end of everything. Well, the goals of militarization of space, in fact, go way beyond this. And this is all public documents. There's no reason not to know it. The Clinton documents of the Space Command, who's in charge of this stuff, they actually publish brochures for public use. You know, like you look at the front page, it's like a kind of thing that, you know, people give to corporate executives with big words and underlining so the dumbest person can follow it, that sort of thing. On the front page of the document, there's one called Vision for 2020, and it announces the primary goal of militarization of space, namely dominating the space dimension of military operations to protect U.S. interests and investment. And that's described accurately as the next plausible stage in a historic task. So in earlier on, you know, countries developed armies. Like the United States, they said, needed an army during the westward expansion of the continental United States, which of course was in self-defense. I don't have to comment about that. And nations also built navies to protect and enhance their commercial interests. And the next logical step is space forces, quoting still, to protect U.S. national interests, military and commercial, and investments. That's just normal. That includes national missile defense, but also space-based strike weapons enabling the application of precision force from, to, and through space. So that's the next step beyond navies. But this is going to be different from navies in one crucial respect. The British could construct a huge navy, but it could be countered, like Germany could build a navy to counter it, and Japan could build a navy, and that had certain consequences which we don't have to talk about. But this is going to be different. The reason is that the United States will be so far in the lead, so overwhelmingly dominant in militarization of space and placing destructive offensive military weapons there on computer-controlled alert, that nobody will be able to counter it, at least in the imagined world. That'll make the U.S. immune. That's one of the reasons why we have to vastly outspend all adversaries and allies combined, and even increase it further. Requires total dominance, so nothing can counter U.S. hegemony, which, remember, is for the benefit of the world by logic. And the U.S. will then remain immune except for one thing, that very narrowly circumscribed category of terrorism, which is allowed to enter the canon because somebody else does it to us. Well, they go on, interestingly, to say that this need for, I'm talking about the military planners, the need for total dominance will increase as a result of the globalization of the world economy. The reason is that globalization is expected to bring about a widening of the divide between the haves and the have-nots. That's an assessment which is shared by U.S. intelligence and by U.S. academic specialists. A big study was just put out under CIA auspices, but it's the whole intelligence agencies with outside academic experts and others, called it's planning for the next 15 years. And their conclusion is that globalization should proceed on course, though its evolution will be rocky, marked by chronic financial volatility, which incidentally translates into slower growth and more suffering for the poor majority, and also a widening economic divide. Okay, that's the prediction if everything works right. Slower growth and a widening economic divide. The military planners make the same assessment, and they're concerned that the widening divide is going to lead to unrest among the have-nots, the growing numbers of have-nots, and that, of course, requires that the U.S. has the force to control it, quoting them, using space systems and planning for precision strike from space as a counter to the worldwide proliferation of weapons of mass destruction by unruly elements, which is a predictable consequence of the recommended programs and is pretty easy in the future, just as the widening divide is an expected consequence of the preferred form of globalization. And notice that that's counter to the economic theories that are professed, right? According to the economic theories that you study at Stanford, globalization is supposed to lead to a single market, right? That's the measure of international integration. But what's expected is exactly the opposite. Namely, it's going to lead to a widening divide, which is correct for the form of globalization that is intended. It's not international economic integration. It's a particular form of corporate-oriented globalization, which is sometimes described honestly. So like the Wall Street Journal describes what are presented publicly as free trade agreements, they call them free investment agreements, and that's correct. That kind of globalization, you expect to reduce globalization in the technical sense, but to increase it in the doctrinally preferred sense with much slower growth, which has been a characteristic of the past 25 years anyway. It's going to slow even more because of increasing financial volatility, more suffering, and a widening divide, meaning less globalization in the sense of an economics course, but more in the sense of reality, preferred doctrine at least. Well, they could have gone on to give a deeper historical background. It's getting late and I won't do it. But if you look at the history of industrialization, history of industrial development, you discover very quickly that since the 18th century, the modern industrial revolution, it's been very heavily military-based. That includes the American system of mass production that amazed the world in the 19th century, which came out of armories, Springfield Armory mainly. It includes the basis of the automotive industry. A century ago, the main technical problems in mechanical and electrical engineering had to do with things like placing a huge gun emplacement on a moving object, namely a ship, and trying to set it up so it could hit another moving object, namely another ship. Those were problems which are kind of analogous to the problems of space vehicles today, and working on those within the military system made it possible to socialize the costs and the risks, means the public pays for them under the military cover, but then privatize the profits if anything works out. And that's exactly what's expected from the current space system. And in fact, anyone who looks at the modern economy knows that's how it developed. So the so-called new economy, computers and telecommunications and all that kind of stuff, almost entirely comes out of the very dynamic state sector. That's why if you look at the World Trade Organization rules, they have a thing called a national security exemption, which means that you're allowed to violate the rules for national security. Well, national security means anything having to do with the military, and for the United States, that means the whole cutting edge of the economy for the last 50 years and for the future, and in fact, a good bit of the past. And the same for other industrial countries. Doesn't do Haiti much good, but for the guys who run the world, the masters of the universe, it does them a lot of good. Well, throughout history, it has been understood that all of this is very dangerous. And in fact, that's, we have a history of wars that tells us how dangerous it is. What's different now is just the scale. and the scale is qualitatively different. It's not slight differences. Well, I'm going to stop. There's a lot more to say about all of this. These are some, not all, of the deep abysses into which we ought to be peering. The good side of the story, which there really is less need to talk about because we all know it and we don't have to congratulate ourselves on achievements, but there have been plenty of them. I mentioned that we're now commemorating the 40th anniversary of the attack on South Vietnam without any notice. The reason there's no notice is because there was no protest at that point in, say, Berkeley or anywhere else. Nobody cared if the United States was going to start bombing another country and attack it with chemical warfare. That's fine. That's what we do. No American president could conceivably do anything like that today. It took years at that time before any protest developed. Out of that protest and the parallel civil rights movement and other popular developments, big changes took place. One change that the changes that took place over the past 30 or 40 years have made the country a lot more civilized. There couldn't conceivably have been a meeting like this 40 years ago, or probably even 20 years ago. There's been a constant improvement. Places just a lot more civilized in lots of dimensions. You go back to the 1960s, there was no feminist movement, there was no environmental movement, which meant nobody cared if there's not going to be if there won't be an environment in which our grandchildren could survive, just wasn't an issue. There were no solidarity movements, no mass anti-nuclear movement, no anti-apartheid movement, no anti-sweatshop movements, no movements opposing international economic integration of the investor rights style, which was already going on. Nothing. I mean, there's some, but not very much, kind of marginal. Now it's enormous. Furthermore, it's worldwide. Particularly with regard to international economic integration, what's ludicrously called globalization, or free trade, or one of these other propaganda terms, opposition to that has been going on extensively in the South, like in Brazil and in India, for years, for decades, in fact. Finally, in the last couple of years, it hit the North, in Seattle. That's why you constantly read, and when it's in the North, you can't ignore it. Like if it's just hundreds of thousands of Indian peasants and so on, you can kind of pretend it's not happening. But when you see it in the streets of Seattle, it's happening. So therefore, that's called the beginning of the anti-globalization movement, which is ridiculous for one thing, because it's not opposed to globalization. Nobody sane is opposed to that. And it's not starting in the North. We're coming along behind, but it's a good thing because it's the first time ever that there has been a real international, the beginnings of a real international. That's what's been the core ideal of the left and the working class movement since their beginning in the 19th century. And this is the first seeds of it. In Porto Alegre in Brazil a month ago, it was very impressive. 60, 70,000 people from all over the world, south, north, every possible, peasants, workers, environmentalists, all kinds of activists, essentially working on the same things, and very seriously. I mean, the descriptions in the press, which are comical because they're terrified. They're terrified of what's going on, and rightly. What's going on are substantial popular movements which are completely unprecedented in scale, are growing out of the changes that have been taking place over the past few decades. It continues a historical course. I mean, there's been a long struggle to attain more rights, more democratic control, and it's continuing and probably accelerating. And it's a tendency running counter to the tendency towards destruction. And exactly which curve is going to move up faster will determine the fate of the species. That question is pretty much in the hands of people like you.